Good evening and welcome to the Writer's Block. I'm your host, John Ronan, and as you know now, because we are well into our 29th year, I interview writers about their craft, what they're working on, what they've accomplished, what they're planning for the future. It's a pretty wide net, however, and we do have other brands of artists on occasionally. We have had on recently an artist and a sculptor, and we have had on musicians and actors and all sorts of other creative people. So if you have an idea for a guest who would be good for the Writer's Block, writer of any brand or another kind of artist, watch for our address at the end of the show. We would love to get your suggestions. I also want to remind you that this program is a product of 1623 Studios, which is a cable access corporation. These programs are for and about Cape Ann, and you don't get that wonderful service if you subscribe to Dish. Stick with cable, stick with the Writer's Block. Tonight on the Writer's Block, I'm happy to say we do have a writer. His name is John Christie, a name that might be familiar to some of you old-timers out there, because quite some time ago, John began a quite distinguished career at the Gloucester Daily Times. He's a native of Dover, New Hampshire, where he went to St. Aquinas High School and later to UNH, where he wrote the beginning of his career, the very, very beginning, for the New Hampshire, the school newspaper. He later was a reporter in Beverly, a longtime reporter here in Gloucester. He worked for the Ottawa newspapers and covered the State House, and then began some travels. He went to Florida as an editor and was there for a number of years before returning to New England, where he lived and worked as a publisher in Maine. In 2017, he came back to Gloucester, and he's here to stay. John Christie, welcome to the Writer's Block.
John, you're absolutely right. I'm here to stay. I don't know why the heck I ever left, but I always knew I'd come back.
You feel
so
that?
I'm glad I did. Oh, we love it here.
Yeah.
Always was my favorite place. I call it my adopted hometown.
You're adopted better than New Hampshire.
Better than New Hampshire.
You didn't want to...
When I found this place, I knew I belonged here, and I'd come back eventually.
I want to, before we get to your book, which we want to talk about extensively, I want to ask you about where your journalism bent came from. Was there somebody in your family who always read the newspaper to you, or people valued newspapers? Where did that inspiration or that drive come from?
You know, everybody in that period, my father was not educated man. He didn't graduate from high school, but he read 2 papers a day. The paper was always around, but I wasn't really interested in the paper. I planned to be, I was pre-law. I planned to be a lawyer. I had this crazy idea at the University of New Hampshire that lawyers know how to have to write, because they have to write those things called briefs, right? I didn't know what a brief was, but I know they had to write briefs. So I said, I'll sign up for a writing course called expository writing, basically basic nonfiction writing. And I got lucky. The professor there was a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, a guy named Darnell M. Murray, later a Boston Globe columnist, founder of the writing coach movement across the country in newspapers, Time magazine, author. And he's very inspirational. And he said, you know what, you should go work at the school paper. I think you can write. I don't think he was right. I couldn't write at all, but he thought I could, and he gave me the confidence. I thought, you know, I'm at college. I should belong to something. So I went to the school paper. And,
which is known
as
cleverly
the New Hampshire,
as the New Hampshire.
Just the New Hampshire. Not New Hampshire something, just the New Hampshire. And I was a young guy, and they said, yeah, sure. And they gave me an assignment they thought nobody would do. They said, why don't you go and cover the annual agricultural fair at University of New Hampshire Ag School? And I'm sure they were laughing when they gave me this assignment as a sophomore, because none of those guys wanted to go to the Ag School fair and 6 o'clock in the morning and write about who had the biggest heifer and the smartest pig. I didn't know that. And I went and took some notes and wrote a story, and they liked it well enough to put it in the college newspaper. And there it was, a feature story about the agricultural fair at the school with my name, by John Christie, on there. And that was pretty much it for me.
It is nice to see your name in print the first time.
And it gives you, as a kind of shy fellow, and it gave me the excuse to get myself into places that I would never have the courage or the confidence to go into. And newspapers could do that for people. And it's a great place for people who are a little shy.
Yeah.
Because you need excuse.
You need an excuse. Often in the past, when I was interested in something, I decided to do a story. Then you go and say, you're a reporter. Yeah. It's not like, I'm a goofy guy walking around and wonder what the hell you're doing.
And being a reporter is kind of a classy thing, back then at least. And not only did people like it, but I recognized that, so did co-eds. They thought that was pretty impressive too. So it's something else going for me. Didn't have any good looks, just I'm a reporter. Pretty cool.
Yeah. Newspapers were very much more important then than they are now.
They had a little different status then.
What years were you, because we're here in Gloucester, what years were you at the Gloucester Daily Times?
About 72 to the late 70s.
So 8 years?
Yes, yeah, as both a reporter and the city editor. So I had a couple different jobs here.
Can you name one or two of the big stories that you worked on during those 8 years?
Yeah, well, one of them was a good process story. It was the Charter Commission being, this was when the Reform Council came in and wanted to change the charter.
Yes.
And I covered all those meetings, so I learned a lot about the process of government by covering that. There were, I did a big package for the paper about the police department that got a lot of fame at the time and a lot of attention.
A lot of turning up a lot of facts that were not always so popular.
I wasn't terribly popular, so much that the city council had a hearing about me, in which the police department got people from the old age housing to come and hold a sign at the hearing that said, "Next time you need a policeman, call John Christie." So that was one of the big stories at the time. Covered the school board. I covered City Hall. Urban renewal was a big story back then. A lot of good feature stories. I had a great time covering news and features.
That was the period where they tore down all the old buildings around the Fitzhenry Lane.
Right,
house.
just as I got here, they were tearing down the last buildings in Fitzhenry. And I-4C2 was vacant then, and it's vacant now.
Yeah, that's a real tribute to Gloucester.
A lot of good mayors back then. I covered Leo Alper and Bob French and Steve Moynihan and John Bell, Mac Bell. A lot of great characters, and I'm still friendly with many of them.
I want to ask you briefly, because we want to get to the book that you're just finishing up. Can you give us a short highlight from the State House and your travels in Florida and Maine?
Well, I like to say I got to the State House at the end of Dukakis I, covered all of Ed King and the beginning of Dukakis II. Because if you remember, Dukakis got unelected after his first term because progressives and liberals in the state thought he wasn't progressive enough, and they all thought, we'll vote for him. He'll still win, but he'll get a message. Well, he did. He lost, and they had to live with Ed King for 4 years, and then Mike came back for a while. That was a time during Billy Bulger was the president of the Senate. Tommy McGee was a Speaker of the House. It was real hardcore old Boston politics. It was fun to cover.
And when Whitey, his brother, was still in command.
He was still in command. People didn't talk about him as much back then. It took a while for him to make himself more noticeable in the news. I think Billy managed to keep an arm's length from him, but eventually we learned out more about Whitey. But he was still around at the time, and it got worse as time went on. And
then why did you, or how did you go to Florida? How long were you there?
When I left the State House, I went back to my original paper, the Beverly Times, as the editor for a while. And so I'd been working at small to medium-sized papers my whole career at that point. And in this business, you want to test yourself at a large newspaper. And so I was and I wanted to test myself at a large paper and also live outside of New England, because I love New England, but it's a bit insulated here especially in terms of ethnicity and race. And I wanted to live someplace that was more diverse and more various and at a big paper. And I'd gone to a conference and met some people and basically got a call from a headhunter. Would you like to come down to this paper in Fort Lauderdale? It's a pretty big paper and it's got a lot of growth opportunities. And I thought, South Florida, that's different. That's going to be a whole new way of life for me, a whole different set of people. And the paper was in a big growth spurt. So I went from working for papers that were in the 10,000 to 50,000 range to working for a paper that was about nearly the size of the Boston Globe.
In terms of circulation? In
terms of circulation, yeah. And it's in Broward County, which is constantly growing and expanding, and there's all kinds of news. It's a big breaking news story. Even today, it's in the news today because of the election results. Right. So it's a great place to be a journalist.
Now, one last travel commentary. You went back to Maine, and you were the publisher of 2 papers, if I remember correctly.
Yeah, 2 daily newspapers and a weekly newspaper. Yeah.
And did you write then at all, or edit
No, I
at
went
all?
there when I was at the paper in Florida. I started in the newsroom and eventually got to the business side because opportunities came up, and I liked the whole business of newspapers. So when I left the paper in Fort Lauderdale, which is owned by the Tribune Company, I had a very grand title, Vice President of Strategy and Development. So I was doing all the strategic planning for the company, all its mergers and acquisitions. I learned the business side, but I'd missed New England. My mother was older. She's living in Dover. I knew I needed to come back, and I got a lucky opportunity through some friends that there was an opening to run these 2 small daily papers around the size of the Gloucester or Beverly paper in central Maine. One's in Augusta, one's in Waterville. And they were owned by the Seattle Times Company, so the ownership was great. So I'm up there as the publisher, which is a confusing job for people. It's basically the person who hires everybody else to do something and to make sure everybody gets paid.
Kind of like the producer of a movie,
Yeah.
rather than the director or the editor. Who's
It's not very exciting, but someone's got to do it.
So you migrated from being a political science major at UNH, but writing for the New Hampshire, and being a reporter, to the business side while you were moving to Beverly, Gloucester, State House, Florida, Maine.
Right, and then when my papers were sold by the Seattle Times Company, I got to do what I wanted to do in my life. And the thing I liked most in my career at that point, I felt, was being an investigative reporter. I'd been an investigative reporter here in Gloucester quite a bit.
You had done great work here.
I'd done quite a bit of investigative work at the State House. And when I was in Fort Lauderdale, I ran the investigative team that there was a finalist for Pulitzer Prize. So I said, well, you know what? In Maine, no one's doing investigative reporting. I'm free to do what I want. So, along with my wife, Naomi Shalit, we founded a nonprofit news service that did investigative stories about the state of Maine government. And the idea was that we would get funding by foundations and donors and produce investigative stories, which we gave to every newspaper in the state at no cost. And I did that for about 8 years.
8 years?
Yeah.
And the name of the company was?
The Maine Center for Public Interest Reporting.
And that's still being run by others in Maine?
It is still. The website is pinetreewatchdog.org.
Say that again?
Pinetree Watchdog. Pinetree Watchdog.
All one word?
All one word. Yeah. Still being run. I'm still consulting with them.
Good. Now, I know on another topic, you stayed investigative reporter, investigating your own background in life. And I want to make sure we talk about your personal memoir, which I'm going to read the title of, which is very, very interesting. You have to explain this very quickly because we'll be suspended here. Prince of Wentworth Street, An American Boyhood in the Shadow of a Genocide. Tell me about that title.
Well, first off, if you'd seen Wentworth Street, where I grew up, you know no princes came from Wentworth Street. It's a dead-end street in a mill town in New Hampshire. It's a tenement. I grew up in a tenement building. My grandmother lived on one side. We lived in the middle, and the third side was rented out. And I say Prince of Wentworth Street because despite our modest, very modest situation, I was a firstborn grandson to this family, in which overhanging the whole family was this genocide in Armenia. The early part of the 20th century, the Ottoman Empire, the Turks, tried to wipe out all the Armenians in their empire because the Turks were Muslim, the Armenians were Christian, there were political differences, social differences, and very analogous to what happened in Germany, a few decades later, ethnic cleansing. And my grandmother lost her family, or most of her family, in that process. Came to New Hampshire as a mail-order bride for an Armenian man who got here earlier. And as I looked at my life, I realized the way I was treated, which is sort of as poor as we were, and we're not that poor, but pretty poor, as a sort of precious commodity. Why was I treated that way, despite the small resources they have? They were trying to, through me, make up for all the tragedies in their life, all the awful things that had happened, starting with this genocide. So I was the prince. I got to name people. If I called my Aunt Lillian Aunt Liddy, which I did because I couldn't say Lillian, from then on, she was Aunt Liddy. I couldn't say Aunt Mary. I called my Aunt Mary Army May because I couldn't say Aunt Mary. Everybody called her Army May because Johnny said that's her name. So I wasn't showered with money or gifts, but I was showered with attention and sort of almost low expectations. Just be a good boy, John. That's all we expect of you.
So you were the prince.
I was the prince, yeah.
I also want to make sure we point out that Turkey still denies its responsibility for those massacres.
Thank you very much. That's absolutely true.
Those massive
It's a point of despair with Armenians across the world. They're one of the great diasporas of the world, the Armenian diaspora. We're a small knit group, but people know about us to some degree. And Jewish people, is awful. They got recognized by Germany about what happened. People deny the Holocaust, but the country of Germany admits it and has tried to do right to some degree by things.
Yeah.
The Turks have never admitted it. They said, well, yeah, some Armenians got killed, but so some Turks got killed, and it was really a political difference with us. But every historian disagrees with that.
Yeah.
Most countries have recognized it as a true genocide. In fact, if you go to the Holocaust Museum in D.C., you'll see a quote from there from Hitler. Hitler was asked in the 30s, you want to get rid of all the Jews in Germany. You're not going to get away with it. It's not. How can we do it? And he said, what his answer was, who remembers the Armenians? And that quote is hanging on the wall there at the museum. And so the Armenians were the first genocide of the 20th century. The word genocide was invented by an attorney who did all the research of it, and it was based on what happened to the Armenians.
Armenia is a section of Turkey that is on the south central Mediterranean coast. Is that correct?
It's a confusing answer to your question. There is a Republic of Armenia, which is way on the eastern side of Turkey, that is an independent country, previously had been a Soviet republic, and they got that in the end of World War II. But historic Armenia is just where you said it was. Where the Armenians were originally from, for the most part, was in central and southeast Turkey. And that's where my grandmother was from. Her district was known as Musada, and it is on the Mediterranean coast.
I know. I want to make sure we get to the further memoirs after you left Wentworth Street. Tell us about this memoir. I'm going to repeat the title. The Prince of Wentworth Street, An American Boyhood in the Shadow of a Genocide. Summarize the book for us.
Concept is, when you're our age, and you've lived most of your career, I discovered that when I was in my 60s, that I felt a little bit adrift because I had been divorced, so I no longer had the title of husband. I was still a father, but my son was in his 30s, so I didn't really have the title, the responsibilities with the title of father. My company had been sold, and the title I had in the community was gone. I felt a bit adrift and wondered, in that situation, how did I become who I was? Where did I come from? Because now I'd lost the superficial aspects of who I was and had to wonder about myself, who was the core of me? How did I become who I was? And I thought, as an investigative reporter, what we always do is, when you want to know the story, you go back to the beginning. What was the beginning? So I said, I knew this thing about my grandmother and being a refugee from the genocide, but knew no details.
The mail order
bride.
Right.
I knew there was a genocide, she was a victim, a refugee, but they never talked about the details of my family. So I started asking around the family, and what they always said to me was, you got to get Cousin Tammy's tape. Cousin Tammy made a tape of Nana. Cousin Tammy had this, taught to Nana, it's all on that tape, Johnny, you got to find it. And it took me a while, but I tracked down an aunt who had a CD of an interview with my grandmother that a cousin had done, and there was the full story of her life. And the answer to my question, I say in the book, all begins with a murder in 1909 in the hills above the Mediterranean, when my grandmother went out as a 9-year-old to the field to gather the cows. And a Turkish boy comes up to her and says to her, They're killing the Kafirs. They're killing the Kafirs. Kafir is Turkish for infidels. Infidels are Christians. The Turks were coming for the Christians in her village. She ran back to her house, and her father was putting on his bandolier, his rifle, and his sword, and left to join the other Armenians to confront the Turks. By the end of the day, they found his body by a stream, slaughtered, probably killed with axes, because that was a common tool to kill people back then. As my grandmother said, all that was left was his homespun cotton shirt. And from that moment on, the rest of the family were prey and refugees and had to run for their lives. And that's where my story begins.
Quite a start. And not at all the restful, friendly atmosphere on Wentworth Street.
Right. But all of that trauma and drama is in the family, but hidden. And to make up for it, they've got the prince. But I want to know the full story. And I don't want to forget the past, and I want to honor my relatives for the sacrifice they made. So the book ends. I go back to her village. She never went back. She was afraid to go back to her village. In fact, we didn't even know where she was from.
You went back with your son?
With my son in this June. She said, where was Nana from? I asked everybody. Swedia, Suedia. Okay, well, I eventually found Swedia on a map. But when I got to Turkey and I talked to her, I said, oh, Swedia, that's down here. Well, that's where I'm going to go, down the other trade. Goes, and I don't know what village she's from. Oh, well, there's 28 villages. I said, well, oh, my God, which one is she from? I don't know anything about Swedia. Well, I met some people who said, well, there's 6 of the villages are historic Armenian. So she's she's from one of those 6 villages. So I went to those villages, and I asked around, and I had a couple clues. One was when she was told about the Turkish boy they were killing the Kafirs, she ran back to her house, and the way there, she ran through mulberry trees. And the mulberry trees, she said, were tapping her cheeks. So I knew there were mulberry trees. When they had to escape, they hid for a day in the local silk factory. Now, the mulberry trees were grown to sell the leaves to the silk factory. The leaves are the food for silkworms, from which silk is made. So I asked around 2 or 3 days in this hill village, mostly Turks, a few Armenians left, but mostly Turks. Oh, yeah. Eventually, an Arab lady who's sitting outside a little convenience store up in the hill says, oh, well, they closed that down in 1939, but there it is, over in that corner. That's where the factory was. So there was a factory, there were the mulberry trees, so I found her village. I didn't find a house, I had no address, but I knew it was her village from all the details. And I knew it was an Armenian village because in the older homes are made of stones the size of softballs. And in some of those stones, you can find engraved a Christian cross. And so even though it's all Muslims living there, you knew it was a Christian community at one point.
Your investigative reporting skills really paid off.
Yeah, and thank you.
So you're doing a family mystery and describing your growing up within this bubble of mystery and shadow of genocide. Now, I want to make sure I don't forget to ask, and don't say, as we record today, this is not yet published. What point is it, and when can we optimistically expect it to appear?
Well, it's a point of I'm looking for an agent and a publisher, and that process will probably take a few more months. And I'm hoping they'll be published by the fall of 2019.
2019.
I have a publisher lined up. It's a real publisher. It's not a vanity house, but it's a small publisher. And he said, John, if you can't get it published by a big New York house, I will publish it. So I know it'll be published.
So it
will be published. But he's very nice. He said, try to find it. Your book sounds pretty good.
That's a tremendous relief.
It is a relief, right?
You're not going to write, and this is going to disappear when.
It's 70,000 words. I've written 3 or 4 different times, as you know. It's there's a lot of typing involved.
How many pages is that?
It would be probably 200, 2 to 250 page book. Not a long book. It's I'm not a famous person who wants to read my story. If it's not interesting, it's not worth anything. So it's not a long book. It's a modest sized book.
So we can expect fall of 2019.
I sure hope so.
We'll Well, this show will go on.
Yeah, this will be. I'll be on
a great help. I'm going to repeat the title one more time. Prince of Wentworth Street, An American Boyhood in the Shadow of a Genocide. That title should certainly draw some attention. It's a great title. I always try to ask, and we're almost out of time, if in 20 seconds, what advice would you give to a young writer about starting out? Just very briefly.
Read a lot. Don't give up. My favorite quote about writing is from Red Smith, the sports writer. There's nothing to writing, Red Smith said. Just sit down and open up a vein.
Right. We are almost out of time. John Christie, I want to thank you very much for coming down to the Writer's Block and telling us about this memoir in mystery that you have investigated based on your extensive investigative reporting skills and in journalism on both sides of the editorial business fence. I'm sure it will come out, and when it does, we'll have to have you back.
Oh, that'd be great. Thank you. Love it, John. Thank you very much for having me.
I want to thank you in TV land for being with us as well. If you've learned something about journalism and the Armenian genocide early in the last century from John Christie, then the Writer's Block has done its job. Thanks for being with us, and I hope to see you again next week on the Writer's Block. Good night.